I don't come to you today as an expert. I come to you as someone who has been really interested in how I get better at what I do and how we all do. I think it's not just how good you are now, I think it's how good you're gonna be that really matters. I was visiting this birth center in the north of India. I was watching the birth attendants, and I realized I was witnessing in them, in extreme form, this very struggle, which is how people improve in the face of complexity, or don't. The women here are delivering in a region where the typical birth center has a 1 in 20 death rate for the babies, and the moms are dying at a rate 10 times higher than they do elsewhere. Now, we've known the critical practices that stop the big killers in birth for decades. And the thing about it is that even in this place especially, the simplest things are not simple. We know, for example, you should wash hands and put on clean gloves. But here, the tap is in another room, and they don't have clean gloves. To reuse their gloves, they wash them in this basin of dilute bleach. But you can see there's still blood on the gloves from the last delivery. 10% of babies are born with difficulty breathing everywhere. We know what to do. You dry the baby with a clean cloth to stimulate them to breathe. If they don't start to breathe, you suction out their airways, and if that doesn't work, you give them breaths with the baby mask. But these are skills that they've learned mostly from textbooks, and that baby mask is broken. In this one disturbing image for me is a picture that brings home just how dire the situation is. This is a baby 10 minutes after birth, and he's alive, but only just. No clean cloth, has not been dried, not warming skin to skin, an unsterile clamp across the cord. He's an infection waiting to happen, and he's losing his temperature by the minute. Successful child delivery requires a successful team of people. A whole team has to be skilled and coordinated. The nurses who do the deliveries in a place like this, the doctor who backs them up, the supply clerk who's responsible for 22 critical drugs and supplies being in stock and at the bedside, the medical officer in charge responsible for the quality of the whole facility. The thing is that they are all experienced professionals. I didn't meet anybody who hadn't been part of thousands of deliveries. But against the complexities that they face, they seem to be at their limits. They were not getting better anymore. It's how good you're gonna be that really matters. It presses on a fundamental question. How do professionals get better at what they do? How do they get great? And there are two views about this. One is the traditional pedagogical view. That is that you go to school, you study, you practice, you learn, you graduate. And then you go out into the world and you make your way on your own. A professional is someone who is capable of managing their own improvement. That is the approach that virtually all professionals have learned by. That's how doctors learn, that's how lawyers do, scientists, musicians. And the thing is, it works. Consider, for example, the legendary Juilliard violin instructor, Dorothy DeLay. She trained an amazing roster of violin virtuosos, Midori, Sarah Chang, Itzhak Perlman. Each of them came to her as young talents, and they worked with her over years. What she worked on most, she said, was inculcating in them habits of thinking and of learning so that they could make their way in the world without her when they were done. Now, the contrasting view comes out of sports. And they say, you are never done. Everybody needs a coach. Everyone, the greatest in the world, needs a coach. So I tried to think about this as a surgeon. Pay someone to come into my operating room, observe me, and critique me. It seems absurd. Expertise means not needing to be coached. So then which view is right? I learned that coaching came into sports as a very American idea. In 1875, Harvard and Yale played one of the very first American rules football games. Yale hired a head coach. Harvard did not. The results? Over the next 3 decades, Harvard won just 4 times. Harvard hired a coach. And it became the way that sports works. But is it necessary then? Does it transfer into other fields? I decided to ask, of all people, Itzhak Perlman. He had trained the Dorothy DeLay way and became arguably the greatest violinist of his generation. So we ended up having an almost 2-hour conversation about how he got to where he got in his career. And I asked him, I said, why don't violinists have coaches? And he said, I don't know, but I always had a coach. You always had a coach? Oh yeah, my wife Toby, they had graduated together from Juilliard, and she had given up her job as a concert violinist to be his coach, sitting in the audience, observing him and giving him feedback. Itzhak, in that middle section, you sounded a little bit mechanical. What can you do differently next time? It was crucial to everything he became, he said. Turns out there are numerous problems in making it on your own. You don't recognize the issues that are standing in your way, or if you do, you don't necessarily know how to fix them. And the result is that somewhere along the way, you stop improving. And I thought about that, and I realized that was exactly what had happened to me as a surgeon. I'd entered practice in 2003, and for the first several years, it was just this steady upward improvement in my learning curve. I watched my complication rates drop from one year to the next, and after about 5 years, they leveled out. And a few more years after that, I realized I wasn't getting any better anymore. And I thought, is this as good as I'm going to get? So I thought a little more, and I said, okay, I'll try a coach. So I asked a former professor of mine who had retired, his name is Bob Osteen, and he agreed to come to my operating room and observe me. The case, I remember that first case, it went beautifully. I didn't think there would be anything much he'd have to say when we were done. Instead, he had a whole page of dense with notes. Just small things, he said, but it's the small things that matter. Did you notice that the light had swung out of the wound during the case? We spent about half an hour just operating off the light from reflected surfaces. Another thing I noticed, he said, your elbow goes up in the air every once in a while. That means you're not in full control. A surgeon's elbows should be down at their sides, resting comfortably. So that means if you feel your elbow going in the air, you should get a different instrument or just move your feet. It was a whole nother level of awareness. And I had to think, there was something fundamentally profound about this. He was describing what great coaches do. And what they do is they are your external eyes and ears, providing a more accurate picture of your reality. They're recognizing the fundamentals. They're breaking your actions down and then helping you build them back up again. After 2 months of coaching, I felt myself getting better again. And after a year, I saw my complications drop down even further. It was painful. I didn't like being observed. And at times I didn't want to have to work on things. I also felt there were periods where I would get worse before I got better. But it made me realize that the coaches were onto something profoundly important.